My name is Mike Selden. I'm the Director of Member Information Services with MTA, and I'd just like to welcome everybody to our live Q&A here on cemeteries and park management during the COVID-19 crisis. I'm joined today by Cindy Dodge, who's our resident cemetery expert in our office, and she's going to help answer a lot of your questions. So this is going to be about an hour. We'll adjourn at 1. This is being recorded, just so you know, so your questions that you ask will be answered and will be recorded for others to view. If you do have difficulties viewing it or something, it will be available afterwards. If you'd like to ask a question during this, we do have a few questions that have already come in prior to, but if you'd like to ask a question in the chat feature, you can type in your question and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. If for some reason we don't get to your specific question, you're always welcome, as always, to contact MTA and ask for Cindy, Catherine, or myself, and we're happy to help you the best that we can. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Cindy Dodge, again, our resident cemetery expert, and she's going to introduce herself and we'll get things going. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Again, this is Cindy Dodge. I am a liaison in Member Information Services, the place where you can call or send your email every day from 8 to 5, and myself, Mike, and Catherine will try to answer your questions. We all specialize in certain areas, and one of my specialties is cemeteries. Many of you may have taken my cemetery management class. I also speak for the Michigan Association of Municipal Cemeteries every year in August. I don't know if their conference is going to be held this year or not. If it is, it's going to be at Great Wolf Lodge in Traverse City. So I've been doing this for about 14 years, and I try to keep up with all of the latest trends, either through the internet or through other publications that I subscribe to. So with that, that's who I am. But today we're actually here to talk about cemeteries and parks. And I didn't coin myself as a specialist in park management. However, the reason why we put cemeteries and parks together is because originally cemeteries were part of the park system. Back in the 1800s, in the greater New York area, where they were the people of that area were starting to become more and more concerned about losing green space because of development. The horticultural type societies bought up large tracts of land. And in these large tracts of land, their intent was to provide green space for, at that time, they called it for a place of repose to honor both the living and their active lives, where they could go rest in a tranquil kind of place. So cemeteries were considered parks back in the early 1800s. And in fact, places like Central Park in that are examples of how large tracts of land were bought and converted for both cemetery use and for park use in these large urban areas. And today we're actually, in my classes, I actually try to encourage our townships to start thinking about their cemeteries again as a place of recreation or a place of their park facilities. Maybe you open up your park facilities for walking. There are some townships that actually do historical reenactments where they have a theatrical type production of those that are buried in their cemetery and their characters in that time. They dress up in historical clothing. There are other townships that actually do tours where they just go around and give tours of those that are buried in their cemetery. There's a quote out there that talks about cemeteries being the history of your community in a stone format. So when you walk through a cemetery, essentially, you can look at the names you can look at some of the descriptions on those headstones, and it can provide a history for your local community. So cemeteries are very important to our township services that we offer. So with that, because we do have cemeteries and we do have parks, can they be open right now during COVID-19? This is a question that started rising within the first couple of weeks of the quarantine, the stay at home, and it had been kind of gray up until some of the more recent executive orders, Executive Order 2020-43, and the most current one, 2020-59, that talks about what can be open to the public and what needs to be closed or needs to be closed with or open with restrictions. So both of those executive orders are where you're going to want to look for any detail, although like I said, it does tend to be a little bit gray sometimes. So do your parks and do your cemeteries need to be open right now? That question is really up to you. You could choose to close your cemeteries for foot traffic type of activities, and you could choose to close your parks for those types of foot traffic activities. However, you're not required to. Foot traffic is still allowed with proper social distancing requirements. So if you are going to have your cemetery open to foot traffic and or your parks open to foot traffic, there are some precautions that you should take. Signage is big. You might have a sign out front on a fence. If you do have like playground structures, I've seen where local units have actually put either additional signage around those play structures and or they've actually taped them off with caution tape, because in that Executive Order 43, it talks about restricting those public amusement or recreation areas where people can congregate in more closer proximity. So things like your play structures, maybe you have a skate park. You might want to close your skate park down because that could encourage gathering, and it would be difficult to practice that social distancing. I've gotten a lot of phone calls about disc golf. It seems that many of you do offer the disc golf. What I really want to say, whether it's disc golf or it's a boat launch, which could be a part of your park services, if you as a township are offering that as a service where you actually like rent out or distribute the discs for the disc golf, that you would want to suspend at this time, because now we're touching things, now we're being more closer together potentially. So those types of things you may want to restrict. However, if you do have the disc golf set up and the public is allowed to bring in their own disc for those disc golf, that would be to your discretion whether or not you're going to leave that open to the public. I would imagine that each one of these various different services that you may offer in your parks are going to be something that your township board is going to have to determine on whether or not they want to keep them open. You may need to counsel with your legal counsel about keeping them open, because it's really just going to be a matter of whether or not you can practice some of those social distancing. The CDC actually has a website right now for parks and recreation, and you can go out there and they give a lot of information in terms of signage that you can use, precautions that you can require. There's a lot of good information out there under the Parks and Recreation on the CDC website. So if you choose to have your parks open or you don't choose to have your parks open and cemeteries, you're likely going to need to maintain them, because we do have the responsibility to provide a safe public location in the event, like even if you're closing your cemetery for foot traffic. We do know under the 2020-59 executive order that funerals are allowed to continue in your cemeteries. So even if you're closing for foot traffic, you're likely going to be having some type of funeral service in your cemetery. So that is allowed. Burials are allowed right now. You can have up to 10 people in attendance at those funeral services. I've seen all kinds of information out there about ideas that local units are using for these funeral services. For example, you might require everybody to come in their car and line up along your driveways. They can either stay in their car if you've exceeded the 10-person limit for a funeral service, or you can dismiss those 10 people and guide them to where you want them to sit around the funeral service. I'm sure that you will be working very closely with your funeral director to orchestrate these funeral services. One thing that you do want to note is that people who live within the same household do not need to practice that 6-foot social distancing. So typically when you see a funeral service, you're going to have a number of chairs that are lined up right around the casket for that part of the service. Those that are living in the same household, they would likely sit in those chairs that are right next to each other, but everybody else is going to have to stand within that 6 feet social distancing and no more than 10 people. So you're going to need to prepare for these funeral services with your maintenance of your cemetery, which means your workers who are going to be maintaining your cemetery and or your parks. They are considered at this time essential infrastructure workers. They can maintain the lawn. They can maintain, we did get a question in about trees. Maybe you had some planning to take down some trees this spring or to do some other spring cleanup type of activities. What I'm going to say about that is, can you do that or can you not do that? Again, this is one of those questions where I can't definitively say, yes, it's okay to go in and take down those trees as planned. If those trees are dead and they're at risk of falling, if they've already dropped some big heavy limbs, if there is a safety issue with those trees, then likely you may want to make the decision to go ahead and take them down now. If you have your park or your cemeteries open to that foot traffic and or you're conducting burial services, because you want to keep it, again, a safe public place. So, but if these trees still have good integrity and they're just an area you're trying to clear out, or you're trying to open up for more burial space, or whatever the reasons are for wanting to take that tree down, when it's not really an imminent type of safety issue, then I would suggest that you wait to do that until we have some more of these restrictions lifted. So again, I can't really say whether or not you can take those trees down or not. It really comes down to the township board deciding whether or not they're a safety issue at this time. The other thing that I think about right now is when we talk about spring cleanup, whether it's your maintenance workers or your groundkeepers that are doing the spring cleanup. In a cemetery in particular, you may require your public to come in and do their own spring cleanup, and or they want to come in and do their own spring cleanup around their family members' headstones. They want to clear it out. They want to plant some new annuals. All of those things that people tend to do here in the springtime. So you're going to need to decide whether or not you want to allow that or not. Again, if you're going to allow that kind of spring cleanup where you're going to have the public come in and do work around their own family headstone, you're going to have to monitor that, because we don't want to have poor social distancing. We don't want to create a gathering. And that's really what that 2020-43 talks about, is the gatherings and those places of public access that could create a gathering. So once they start maybe getting past those immediate family members and having others there, then that you would want to prohibit. That might be hard for you to monitor because you're not going to have your maintenance workers there all the time. So again, I think signage is going to be really important right now to let people know what the expectations are in your cemetery and or in your parks. So yes, your employees can be working. Then the question kind of goes a little bit further than that, because not all townships have their own parks and recreation maintenance or groundskeeper employees. They actually contract that out to landscaping type companies, and or if you need to dig a grave, some of you might be using an excavating company to do that. So that was a really gray area there for a while, whether or not we could engage independent contractors to come in and do that work for us right now, since landscapers were prohibited from operating previously. We just saw that open up in the latest executive order. So yes, landscape companies can be out there working. So obviously now you can contract with them to come in and do that maintenance for you. We do have a resource on our COVID-19 webpage for cemetery management, and as a part of that website, we do have a couple of letters, sample letters, that can be given to independent contractors indicating that the work they would be doing for you would be considered essential to the infrastructure of your cemetery and parks. But again, you may not need to use those letters any longer because those landscapers can be out there and can be working now. So let's see, I think that's going to, there's another resource that you might want to reference. I don't know if many of you are familiar with this. I'm just going to hold it up. I don't know if you can see it. It is called American Cemetery and Cremation. They actually have put out a lot of information about operating your cemetery or holding those funeral services during COVID-19. They do have a website, or you may be subscribing to the magazine. Their most current issue of the magazine has several articles in there that might be helpful to you with that. So let me just see here if there's anything else I missed.
One follow-up while you look at that, I know one of the questions that had came in earlier, Cindy referenced when it was referencing talking about, you know, removing the trees and stuff. One of the questions that kind of followed up is, you know, certainly with the COVID-19 crisis that's going on, revenue sharing is going to be going down, and, you know, potentially some other financial hits to local units. And when they're looking to remove trees, you know, funding may not be there for it anymore. So, you know, part of the question was, you know, is there any funding source available that you're aware of to work on trees that might pose a danger to visitors, you know, within the cemetery or to the grave sites themselves?
Right. So I get this question quite a bit, even during normal times, is are there any grant opportunities out there for cemeteries? We know that there are grant opportunities out there for parks. In fact, a lot of townships have a parks and recreation plan as part of their master plan that is often necessary to apply for those types of parks and recreation grants. I haven't personally, in my past experience as a township clerk, ever tried to apply for any of those parks and recreation grants. However, I do have to wonder if, like I stated in the beginning of this webinar is that because cemeteries are a type of park, you may be able to build any kind of cemetery improvements into a Parks and Recreation plan, which in turn could potentially be eligible for those types of grants for Parks and Recreation. That's one thing. Now, in terms of specific types of grants for cemetery improvements, no, I'm not aware of any of those. If there are some out there, you know, I would encourage members maybe to go out to Community Connections and post their experience with any types of grants for that kind of improvement in their cemetery. What I can say, however, is that there have been a lot of unique ideas that townships have implemented in terms of making improvements in their cemeteries. So, for example, volunteers. I know we had a question about volunteers, whether or not you can use volunteers. You can use volunteers in normal times. I don't know that volunteers right now would be considered critical infrastructure workers. They're not someone who is delivering food to senior citizens or some of those other volunteer types of activities that we can use right now during COVID-19. So that is something you would need to check with your legal counsel about, whether or not you could use volunteers in your cemetery during COVID-19. I'm kind of guessing no on that, but I don't want to be the final answer on that. However, during regular times, volunteers are often a great asset for cemeteries and or parks. And yes, you can use volunteers in our book. We have a cemetery management book that comes with a CD. And on that CD, we actually have a release form for volunteers. Certainly, again, you're going to want to coordinate that with your legal counsel to make sure it meets the needs of your particular local unit. But there is a sample on that CD for waivers of volunteers. Somebody asked with that same volunteer question about using the youth as volunteers. I can tell you that youth can be used. In fact, if you're looking for improvement projects in your cemetery or your parks, Eagle Scouts are a good place to look to do that because they're looking for projects as a part of their Eagle Scout program. Yeah, I don't know where I was going to go with that, but yeah, volunteers, you know, are a great asset when we're talking about that. Oh, I know what I was going to say about the use. So one thing about using youth for volunteers, especially when we're talking about things like mowing, you can get into trouble because if you go out to the, you know, like Michigan.gov and go to the employment posters or on MTA's webpage for the employment posters, we have employment posters that need to be posted in terms of using youth as volunteers and or as employees. And there are certain activities that youth cannot perform, whether they're paid or volunteer. And those are things like mowing, even the weed whackers. Sometimes, depending on their age, they can't use the weed whackers either. So you do want to take a look at what is allowed for the youth in terms of using mechanical type equipment. So back to these other initiatives where we might get some grant money. Historical associations, they are often interested in donating money for improvements in cemeteries. There are businesses, a lot of times with businesses. Basically what we say is anytime you want to improve your cemetery, if it's for a public safety reason, then your township, it is a lawful expenditure for your township to eradicate that safety hazard. So for example, if a headstone is broken or a headstone is leaning, it is lawful for a township to use their own money, or that tree that's about ready to come down. It is lawful for a township to spend money to mitigate that safety hazard. However, there are a lot of headstones that are just kind of become discolored. They get that algae on them, and that would be more of an aesthetic issue if you want to do some improvements on that, and that would not be lawful for a township. So that's where your business community can also become very useful in terms of donations for financial support. So the person who asked the questions about taking the trees down and whether or not there might be a grant for that, you might also want to check with some of your businesses. There might be prominent people in your township that might be willing to donate money for those types of activities. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about cemetery management, and this would apply to parks too, is that if you're looking to improve something, like you want to put a fence up, you want to put a bench in, you want to put a play structure in, if people donate, you can actually put a plaque up that gives them notice for their donation or their contribution to that project. So maybe somebody donates to take that tree down, and as part of that donation, it also purchases a new tree to put in. And then there could be a plaque or something at that tree for their donation in recognition of that. So I do think that you can get kind of creative to find other revenue sources for improving both your cemeteries and your parks.
Yeah, and one thing I'd just add before we get into, I think we'll get into some questions from the chat now, but one thing I'd like to add too is another funding source that sometimes people don't think of is possibly your insurance company. I know at least Parkland, which probably a lot of townships use, they used to, I think they still do, but they had a small grant program, which at a previous place of employment for me, I was actually able to secure some cameras for parks there, because preventative, to try to help prevent a loss or a damage. So whether or not that would work for trees that may fall in a cemetery or something like that, I'm not sure, and I don't know if the requirements have changed, but I do know a number of the larger insurance companies that insure municipalities in Michigan do offer some type of grant program like that. So that'd be something to take a look at too.
For sure.
To get into the first question that popped up here in the chat, which is not necessarily COVID-19 related, but I think it's kind of interesting as regarding cemeteries, so I'll ask it anyway. So is there a restriction for the use of a putting stone for a headstone? And maybe to expand on that a little bit, different types of stones, are there any restrictions other than what the township may have in its ordinance or something limiting what type of stone can be used as a headstone?
Right. So I'm glad you brought up the term ordinance, cemetery ordinance. Those of you who have been to my class or who have read any of our material through our book and et cetera, or on our website, know how important the ordinance is. The thing about cemeteries in particular is that there are very few laws actually on the books, so to speak, that guide us in how to manage our cemeteries. And those that are there are extremely old and don't always fit into the current modern day mold. So your cemetery ordinance is the township's law, and that becomes a very important document. And typically in that ordinance, you will have a section that will address the headstone, not only the size, but how many can be on a cemetery space, how quickly they have to place a cemetery headstone. Do they even have to have a headstone? That's a question that comes up quite frequently. What if there's no marker at all? What if the family doesn't place any marker at all? Again, I would suggest to your ordinance that you do require some type of marker, whether it's just a small brick or a small flat stone. But for record keeping purposes, for maintenance, lawn mowing and trimming and such, it's important to know exactly where your burials are at. So again, in that ordinance, you would list out the types of materials that can be used for the headstone. There isn't any law that says, oh, you can't use a wooden cross as a headstone. It's just whether or not your township wants to allow a wooden cross. Typically, if you talk to your sextons, they're going to say no to something like that because they're not sustainable. They don't last over time. So they typically are looking for a more hard stone to be used for the monument or the headstone so that it can withstand the test of time. There is a resource out there, the Preservation of Historic Cemeteries Historical Preservation Guidebook. I believe that's the name of it. And that is on michigan.gov. You can find that there by Googling their search menu, or again, you can always email me and I can send you all these links. But in that guide, they talk a lot about the various different types of composition of various different headstones and what's a good material and what's not, which could help you develop that ordinance language.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. And certainly with the ordinance too, and what type of headstone, sometimes, especially maybe to a sexton or who's ever caring for the cemetery, the material may not matter quite as much when you're talking about different types of stones, but potentially the shape, because for the $25 or $50 that you may be getting for lifetime care of the cemetery, sometimes some of those different shaped objects and different things are much more difficult to mow around and trim around and stuff like that. So that's certainly something to keep in mind too. So we've got a couple questions regarding the 10-person limit. So we'll get into the first one of those, which was asked: is it the township's responsibility to enforce the 10-person and social distancing requirements, or is that the funeral representative who's generally in attendance there? Is it their responsibility?
So that question has come up several times, and the answer to that is I think it's probably going to be a little bit of both. I have had some townships call and say they're directing their sextons or their maintenance workers to not go anywhere near the funeral service, to go and prep the grave and to be gone and come back after everybody is gone to protect their own workers from any contact with those people that might be unknown to them. So that is one option. But if you're going to take that type of option and you're not going to help maintain that social distancing, then it's like using a contractor. You're going to want, because you do want to abide by those executive orders as best as you can, and not overseeing it at all is not really abiding by those orders either. So in that case, you are going to want to work with your funeral director to make sure that someone is going to be on site to direct those 10 people, or make sure that everybody is practicing that good social distancing. So, and you know, this question can be expanded beyond that. We also get the question sometimes about, oh, well, we see some construction work going on. What is the township's responsibility in making sure that they can be conducting that construction right now or not? It's not the local unit. It is your local sheriff who would, you know, enforce any of those executive orders. So it could be too that that might be another option if you are going to have a funeral service and you're not going to have your own maintenance workers there to work with the funeral director. You might want to just let the sheriff know that there is going to be a funeral going on at that time, so that they can drive by, and if they see anything that, you know, is unusual or not in compliance right now, then they could intervene in those types of situations. So I do think you have options there. It's just really what you feel most comfortable with.
Perfect. And so to kind of elaborate a little bit on what the 10 people means, because I know you talked a little bit about families earlier, and that families don't count towards the social distancing. If you live in the same household, you don't have to be 6 feet apart. But what about when you're talking about the 10 people? Is that physically 10 people? Or if there's 3 or 4 people from the same household that are there, does that count as 1, or does that still count as 3 or 4 towards that 10?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. And that is one of those examples where we don't get the definition of what 10 means. It doesn't say, the 4 or 5 people that don't have to social distance plus 10. It just says 10. So if we take that at its most literal interpretation, I would say that it is 10 in total. But again, if they exceed that 10, that's an issue that, would need to be enforced through law enforcement.
Yeah, and I think something that you touched on a little bit earlier, but maybe can elaborate a little bit more on, or just kind of confirm, is with the 10 people, if beyond the 10 that are there, if there are more in their car, can they exceed the 10 people, or is there a certain point where you can?
The 10 applies to the term of gathering. You can't have more than 10 people gathering. Well, if they're in their car and they're not gathering in close proximity, then I don't believe that would meet the definition of gathering. So if there are people sitting off on your side roads in their car in, reverence or memorialization of that loved one, I don't believe that would be included in that 10.
Yeah, and certainly I think
it would be the 10 people physically around the burial service.
Yeah, and something that we probably can't answer specifically is, well, at what distance would it be to start another gathering of 10 people socially distanced apart? Because that could be, some of these cemeteries are huge, and okay, well, if we've got 10 people close to the grave that are social distance, how much further out beyond that could you go before you have another group of 10 social distance apart? I don't think we could probably get into that answer. That would be more on a specific, individual basis to confirm with the attorney or something like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%, Mike, because, I don't know yet if we know, I know we're using 6 feet as the social distancing, but we don't know how it floats through the air. So, yeah. I think that the 10 is designed specifically for that graveside service. So it's not an intent to have 10 people here and then, 30, 40, 50 feet away, 10 more people.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the intent of the restriction. I think the restriction is 10 people total within your cemetery boundaries.
Yeah, perfect.
Gathering. Again, excluding any that might be in their cars.
Yeah. So now, and I think this kind of answers itself a little bit, but maybe it needs some more elaboration on putting out veteran flags for this year. That's one of the responsibilities that a number of townships have with their cemeteries, is putting out the flags at the veteran headstones and stuff. Are there any restrictions that you know of right now for that? That's that they're not required to do it this year, or different things like that?
We don't have any direction that they cannot do it. In fact, I would probably advocate that they will continue to do that. Usually that is done by your groundskeeper, or it is done by your VA, group there in your local area. So again, if it is the Boy Scouts or it's your VA local, then you're going to want to make sure that they are also adhering to any social gathering or social distancing requirements. Maybe just 1 or 2 people out there doing that. Just like as if you had a couple of maintenance workers out there, you'd want your maintenance workers to stay, at a distance. So you wouldn't want, 2 people together putting down flags, passing flags back and forth. You might put 1 person in this section putting flags down, 1 person over here in this section putting flags down. A lot of this is common sense. I can tell you that I did do a little bit of research on some of the veteran memorial type services that we see, and whether or not, because I was thinking to myself, okay, so now we have 10 people, but what if we want, you know, another person or a couple of people playing the taps? Are those people part of the total 10? I do believe they would be part of the total 10, but what I can tell you is that from my research that veteran cemeteries or sections of cemeteries are right now prohibiting any kind of veteran services at this time. Like Arlington is completely closed down, and a lot of other small dedicated veteran memorial cemeteries are closed down right now.
Earlier you had mentioned, you know, kind of more, you know, specifically about the parks, but certainly cemeteries also, regarding signage that can be put up, or roping areas off. And the question came in asking, you know, regarding that signage, is that a requirement that they have something like that up there, or is it just a suggestion that that they put that up?
So that's a really good question. These are always such good questions. And some of this is my personal opinion, but I believe that if you're going to leave your parks and or your cemeteries open to foot traffic, that implies that you have a level of responsibility. Now that level may not go as far as being on site and making sure everybody is, you know, practicing your guidelines, but I do think the bare minimum of putting up a sign is, I don't want to say it is required, but it would be very prudent of your township to put those signs up. And in fact, if you go out to the CDC's website for Parks and Recreation, they do have some sample signage or guidelines to put on your sign.
Thanks. And a question that came through here, and I don't know if it's specific to cemeteries, parks, or just kind of in general. So I'll kind of answer this one real quick. And it's how about masks? Is it required or just strongly encouraged? And I think from from the executive order that's out right now, masks are required if you are indoors in an indoor setting, such as going shopping, working, something like that. The masks are being required along with social distancing. If you're out in a park area that's open, any outdoor setting, it would be, be something that might be encouraged, but it's not anything currently that is required for those type of outdoor settings. So a funeral outside in a cemetery, or walking on a trailer or a park space that might be open right now that's not playground. It might be encouraged, but it's not recommended at this time.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Again, on that signage, you're going to ask the people to take their own personal responsibility, which could include, wearing a mask if they should see fit. But is it required? No, not in an outdoor gathering. I do want to address, though, when we're talking about our employees or even a funeral service, sometimes you'll see at a funeral service where they have like a shovel, and everybody will throw a shovel of dirt onto the casket before they walk away. So that you probably don't want to do that right now, because that would be communal. You would be passing the shovel from one to another. So you either don't allow for that, or you find a different way to do that. That would be, be practicing some of those sanitation issues. In terms of your workers, though, and maybe not necessarily wearing masks, but they may be using shared equipment. They may be using weed whackers. They may be using lawnmowers, whether they're riding or push, chainsaws, shovels, all of those different implements that we use to maintain the cemeteries in the park. OSHA actually, does require, from an employee perspective, that you do take precautions to ensure the spread of COVID among your employees. So you will want to be compliant with any OSHA requirements in terms of providing a safe workplace. And a safe workplace is even outside. using those various different tools that they may be sharing. So they may have to wear gloves. They may have to be wiping them down when they're done using them. Just all of those safety precautions, whether you're indoors or outdoors, when it comes to your employees.
Thank you, Cindy. And then, so another question that came here regarding cemeteries can be closed for, just general foot traffic, but from a funeral, need to stay open. And they're just looking to kind of clarify that, the cemetery still needs to be open for a funeral to bury someone. Is that accurate? So you can close the cemetery for the purpose of foot traffic and people can't get in there and clean graves or whatever they want to do, plant flowers and stuff like that. But if somebody were to be buried in there, the cemetery would have to be allowed, or you would have to allow the cemetery to be open for the burial.
Correct. So the only way in Michigan that somebody can't be buried, it is the family's right to have their family member buried. And the only way that can change is if the family member signs off in writing for some type of storage situation. So whether that storage is on site or it's with a funeral home or maybe a third-party vendor that offers storage, you can't just say we're not going to bury right now and require the family to put their loved one in a storage situation. It has to be approved by that family member. If they don't sign off on the storage, then they do have to be buried. And for cemeteries that have gates that can shut and can lock, that's probably going to be easy to keep people out during regular foot traffic time, and then only have it open during those burial services. But those of you that don't have locked gates, likely, again, signage is going to be really important. And in your cemetery ordinance, you should have a section in there that talks about the hours of operation. So your signage would say something like, these hours of operation have been suspended until, May 15th or until further notice, when you don't have a way to actually lock up your cemetery or park situations.
Thank you. There was another one here that I was, yeah, so this one's asking to kind of clarifying regarding the 10 people. They said there was an order that no gathering in public of any number outside a single household. Is this still in place, or was that changed back to the 10 people? This would be specifically affect parks and activities there. So I think that's more, obviously they said you can have no more than 10 people for a funeral, but in a park for a gathering, is it still 10 people? Or I know at least a lot of times that I see in parks, there's not really gatherings, but you'll see, numerous families that are there kind of amongst themselves. So there's more than 10 people there, but they're not necessarily gathering they're not having a, family reunion or a community picnic or something like that. It's just one individual household that's there, and then you go a little ways and there might be another household.
Correct.
Is that
so
still...
there could be potentially more than 10 people in there. They're just all practicing social gatherings. I actually live right next to a park here in Meridian Township, and they're not putting their picnic tables out. They're not putting their grills up. Their bathrooms are locked. So any of those situations that you could, like having your picnic tables out, for example, that's going to encourage people potentially to be in larger gatherings or beyond their family household. So you might want to wait to put out all of that type of equipment.
Yeah, perfect. So another question here, and I think as we get into May and we get towards Memorial Day, this is a kind of an important question too, is just since we own the cemetery, are we the ones who would say whether we have a Memorial Day ceremony? In this case, the Legion has the parade and the service, which I think is probably the case in a lot of communities where the local American Legion or VFW or somebody like that will have a parade or maybe a local chamber, somebody else will have a parade, they'll have the service at the cemetery. Does the township have the ability to put a hiatus on that right now? Or, you know, if the cemetery is open, could it go on as long as they maintain the social distancing requirements?
Right. So no, I do believe that something like that would have to be canceled right now. In fact, I know here in my area, it's not a township, it's a village, but they've canceled their Memorial Day parade already. Usually those are, like you said, put on by the VA or put on by the chamber or something along that lines. But again, it's kind of like working with the funeral director. They still have to work in coordination with everybody that is impacted by that parade. So even though your township may not have a direct yes or no on that, you know, you'd want to work with those other entities. And at this time, I do not believe you could do that.
Yeah. I think we've kind of answered this one. Can volunteers use township equipment, mowers, weed whackers, leaf blowers, etc.? I think generally that is going to be okay. You just need to be careful to make sure that people sign appropriate waivers. And again, if you get into youth, make sure what they're using, that they're allowed to use those.
Correct.
Let's see, we've just got a few more minutes left, so trying to
and again, I'm just going to interrupt real quick, Mike, because you mentioned it earlier, your insurance carrier, your liability insurance carrier. You may also want to check with them in terms of volunteers and what kind of coverage you would have for that volunteer if they were injured while volunteering.
Yeah. So yeah, so we've got, and here was a comment that just came through too, saying, you know, that they've already been notified by their local DFW that their Memorial Day parade and honor guard ceremony at the cemetery has been canceled too. One that's come through, and it was one that we came through prior, and I think you kind of already answered this, Cindy, in your opening monologue, so to speak, but talking about the township park has an access driveway, which is a lot gate, but the park has kids playground, skate park, 4 baseball fields. Is there guidance on when we can open the park for public use? I think you've kind of already answered that a little bit, but if you want to get into that maybe a little bit more, talking specifically about the parks and, you know, some guidance on that.
Yeah, currently we're using that 2020-43 in terms of amusement or recreational activities or services that can be provided. They primarily use the terminology indoor, like indoor skating rinks, for example. However, I do believe that that applies to the outdoor too. I mean, if you had a skate park, for example, where there could potentially be a gathering situation. I mean, I think we saw early on, like where they do the, is it the trout fishing or the salmon fishing on one of the dams? The gathering got to be so large there. So even though fishing right now is allowed, the gathering got to be so large in that area that they had to close that dam down. So it's the same types of principles.
Yeah. And another question that they were trying to clarify, the magazine that you showed.
Yeah, I've seen that a couple of times.
Yeah, the one that comes in my name that I put on your desk as soon as I get it every month.
Yep. So the website is www.americancemetery.com.
And it's American Cemeteries.
And the magazine is Cemetery and Cremation. And it's real cheap, isn't it, Mike? When you pay the...
I don't remember. I don't think it's very much, but yeah, I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. But yeah,
it's very inexpensive, and it comes monthly, and it's a really great magazine.
Oh, I just see something from Ann. Thank you, Ann. $49.
Yeah,
includes the digital copy. So.
Yep, exactly. Because obviously, I'm not getting my printed copy because we're not in the office right now. So I actually had to log in digitally on their website to see what they had out there for COVID-19.
Yeah. So thank you, Cindy. I think we've gone through the whole list of questions. I don't think that there's anything else here, and we're a couple minutes from 1 o'clock. So as always, I always say the nice thing about when we do trainings or webinars like this, anything along these lines, is you've always got access to the speaker. So certainly you can reach out to Cindy or myself. Catherine Mulhup, who's in our department, she's available too. We're available anytime, Monday through Friday. We're around to email, give us a call. Our emails are, Cindy's is Cindy@MichiganTownships.com, mine is Michael@MichiganTownships.com, and Catherine's is Catherine@MichiganTownships.com, or .org, excuse me, they're .orgs. But they're nice and easy to get to. So I'll turn it over to Cindy and let her give her final thoughts.
Thanks, Mike. So just one more little plug. There were many times in this live webinar where I had to hold myself back because I could have expounded quite extensively on various different topics and or ordinance provisions that you want to consider when it comes to cemetery management. So we do have a webinar out there that is a little dated, but that is available to you right now. But we are also going to be updating that and doing another cemetery presentation here in June. So we're working out the details on the format for that. And so look for that if you're interested in finding out additional information, like you said, that's not really directly related to COVID-19. However, what I'm going to say about that, which I've said on the other webinars that we've held, is that I think that these times are a real learning lesson about what we should anticipate going forward in the future. Whether or not it ever happens again, we can always be prepared, and this may initiate some ordinance amendments as it applies to your cemeteries, particularly because of this situation. So
yeah, and I think with this, it's not a matter of if something like this will happen again, but a matter of when it will happen again, and maybe it'll be another 100 years before we have something like this again. We can only hope. But and one question that I did kind of skip over here, you'd mentioned that they can find samples of signs for cemeteries. Where is that located at again?
Well, you can email me and I can send you some language for that, or at least get you the link to the CDC where they have some samples.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think as Jen just put down our email, Cindy's and mine for you if you need anything to follow up. I think we are pushing right at 1 o'clock here. Probably by the time I shut my mouth, my clock will say 1 o'clock. So with that, we want to thank you again for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time we do this. So have a great day.
Thank you.